and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, we're going to talk about Joan of England.
One day we will be remembered.
Joan of England was born in the year of our Lord, 1321. Her parents are people we've talked about before in episode 1 of season 1. Her parents were King Edward II and Isabella of France. For the story leading up to her birth, go back to the very first episode and catch me back here on the other side. You may have learned from her mother's episode that she wasn't born into a happy marriage. Her father had male favorites that he always put before his wife and children. By the time she was 3 years old, her father had taken custody of all of his children away from Queen Isabella. When she was 4, her mother had gone to France to set up a truce between the kings of England and France, her husband and brother, respectively. This required Joan's 13-year-old brother to join his mother in France to swear fealty in lieu of his father, the king. That's when things got turned upside down. Joan's mother and 13-year-old brother raised an army against her father, and they were successful. When Joan was 5, her father, King Edward II of England, was deposed by her mother, Isabella of France, and replaced with her teenage brother, the now King Edward III. Remember the goat? This is him. So she wasn't the daughter of a king anymore, but she was the sister of a king, and now back with her mother. Her father died the next year under mysterious circumstances, probably murdered by her mother's boyfriend, Roger Mortimer. Her first 6 years were quite eventful, and probably pretty stressful. She was still only 6 years old. With her father dead, England and Scotland decided to give peace a chance again, and what better way to do that than with a royal marriage? 7-year-old Joan was married to Robert the Bruce's 4-year-old son, David, the future King David II of Scotland. The very next year, when Joan was 8 and her husband was 5, Robert the Bruce died at the age of 54, making his 5-year-old son King David II. The king is dead. Long live the king. And just like that, Joan was an 8-year-old Queen of Scots. Does anyone else feel like she's living her life on fast forward? When I was 8, I was crying to my 3rd grade teacher because someone had spread a rumor that I kissed a boy at recess. Joan was the Queen Consort of Scotland. They weren't crowned officially until 2 years later. She was then 10 years old. When Joan was 12, the treaty that had included her political marriage had all but fallen apart. Her brother, the now 21-year-old King Edward III, invaded Scotland. So that's annoying when you're a 12-year-old queen and your 21-year-old brother just invades your country trying to depose your 9-year-old husband. The following year, 13-year-old Queen Joan and 10-year-old King David were sent to France for safety. They were too young to be running the country and far too young to lead the war effort, so it was easier to send them away for safekeeping, while the Guardians of Scotland figured out how to win the war. I will never get over how cool that name is, the Guardians of Scotland. I know what you're thinking. Her mother was Isabella of France, so the King of France is her uncle. How lucky. But nope. A lot had gone down with her grandfather and uncles, and they had no legitimate male heirs. And the French line was an all-boys club. The royal family of France transferred from the Capetian line to the Valois line. So the King of France was family, but not her uncle or even her cousin. The current, for her, King of France was King Philip VI, her mother's cousin. They were welcomed graciously by King Philip VI. After all, he disliked England too. They lived safely in France for the next 7 years in a chateau that was provided for them, although this had to be stressful for her. Her home country, ruled by her brother, had invaded her new country, ruled by her husband, and now she was hiding with her brother's enemy. If you remember from season 1, this was the beginning of the 100 Years' War, and Joan of England was a Scottish queen in exile in France. It was complicated. This is how she spent her teen years from 13 to 20. That was her life. We don't know much about her 7 years in exile. But then, the now 20-year-old Queen Joan and 17-year-old King David were returning to Scotland after their 7-year exile in France. They still had no children, and it wasn't looking promising. The young king and queen didn't seem to like each other very much. It was a complete mismatch. King David ruled Scotland for another 5 years, until he was 22. King David was then captured by the English and imprisoned by his brother-in-law, King Edward III, in the Tower of London. In-laws, am I right? He was imprisoned in England for 11 years. Joan was 25 when he became imprisoned and 36 when he was released. Joan was allowed by her brother to visit her husband while he was imprisoned, and she did. But despite these visits, Joan never became pregnant. I don't get the feeling she was really working too hard on that. He was not the love of her life. When King David was finally released at the age of 33, his wife, Queen Joan, decided she wasn't going to go back to Scotland with him. She didn't like him, and she'd rather go live out in the country with her mother, Isabella of France. Two single gals living their best country life sans men. Her mother only lived for another year or two, and Joan would nurse her mother in her final years. Joan would never reunite with her husband. She would die just a few years later at the age of about 41, still living in England. And that is where I'll leave it for now. What did you think of Joan of England? Her life didn't seem filled with joy. Her parents' marriage was all but over before she could remember. And then there was a nasty custody battle that ended with a war and her father dead. Then married young, attacked by her brother, exiled in France. The happiest part seemed to be when her husband was captured and imprisoned for 11 years. Because she never returned to him or Scotland. I wish she'd had a better life. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.